you're not already a member, we've got the opportunity to do that here, or you can take a brochure with you and think about it. All right, that's my brief pitch. And you talked about Nelson Harris. So I'm working through next fall's schedule of speakers, and I shoot a Facebook message out to Jordan Bell, trying to get him on our schedule. And at the time I was doing that, he was already very visible in this area. He was just coming off like 3 speaker engagements in a row, and I thought, well, he is whooped. He's just wore out. He's not going to respond to me. But he responded right away. Yes, I'd be interested in doing a speaking engagement. And I happen to have said, oh, by the way, we have April open, if that's of interest. And he said, sure, but I can't remember at that time whether I had Mary in the mix or not. But I said, what my thinking is, he had just come off 3 or 4, or maybe 5 or 6, busy man. But he was like celebrity status over the winter that I could tell from accounts. And so I wanted to do something tonight that was just maybe a little bit different. I wanted to be special. And so I said, how about if we put you and Mary Bishop together? Because Mary, if you all don't know, started this whole thing. It's her doing that. She'll talk about this. She was a reporter for the Roanoke Times when she wrote about urban renewal and its devastating effects across the Roanoke Valley. What you may not be aware of is that her work went on to become seminal. It became foundational. I'm trying to look for better words. Her work helped launch a national look at urban renewal. And there was a book that came out called Root Shock, where her work was featured, and Roanoke was one of 3 cities that were featured in that book. And so I'm really proud to know her. I've known her for a long time, back when she was a reporter up in Lexington, I believe, and I was just a little old student up there at Old College, across the street from VMI. And I think that was about the same time or at least you were living up there. Anyways, that's how I first knew you. And then, so she gave me this bio. She says, Mary Carter Bishop, and she wants me to emphasize she's 78, and that'll play in here in a second. I don't know why she did that. But she worked at 5 newspapers, big, small, and medium-sized, over 35 years as a reporter. She took a break from the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1982, rented a cabin in Rockbridge County, and never went back to the big city. In 18 years at the Roanoke Times, she won the George Polk Award and was a Pulitzer finalist for a series about pesticides and exterminators. She is the author of Don't You Ever, My Mother and Her Secret Son, published by HarperCollins in 2018. She grew up the child of servants on a rich man's farm in Keswick, Virginia, outside Charlottesville. Now, Jordan Bell grew up in California and moved to his mother's hometown of Roanoke when he was 9. He'll probably tell you tonight about a ride he took around Gainsboro with either his grandmother or great-grandmother, but then I talked to him earlier and it turned out it's his grandmother and his aunt that ignited his curiosity in history and local stories. By Mary's account and many others, he's already done more at his young age to spotlight our Black history than anyone else ever in Roanoke, especially introducing us to the incredible Black history makers like Oliver Hill, Edward Dudley, the Claytor family, and William Robertson, who all grew up here. Jordan has interviewed scores of African-American elders, including some who had never shared their stories before. When he is not leading walking tours through Gainsboro or helping with lectures such as this one, he can be found working full-time at Apple Ridge Farm as their director of programs. And he said whatever Mary said about him would be fine. But I want to just double check. Was that okay? Very good. We're so happy to have these speakers here tonight. Help me welcome Mary Bishop.
What a treat. Thank you all. What a crowd. See so many good friends. And I'm so pleased to share this evening with Jordan every city in town in America would be better off if they had Jordan Bell. And that is a young person with a lot of energy, a real good memory, who loves talking with older people about what their lives were like and what their history was. So there's about 50 years, I guess, or so between us. And that was interesting to me, and I thought that we could really present well together because we are friends, and I sure admire him, and I'm just honored to be here and be doing this. So Stephen told you that in '78, I was born in 1945, and I grew up on a farm in Keswick, which is a very wealthy area on the east of Charlottesville. Very rich people own these big old plantations, and Mrs. Pillsbury lived down the road, for instance. You know, there's a lot of celebrities. Never baked me a cake. I kept waiting. So, you know, it was a strange place with, you know, really dramatic sociology because my parents were servants, and my mother came there to take care of the owner's children. My father came as a farmhand, and they married there. But there was no middle class. You know, I was born in '45, and so in the '40s and '50s, around that area and around really most of Albemarle County, there wasn't much of a middle class. And so I was always curious about, especially the racial history, because these were old plantations, and we lived on one of those for 40 years in a tenant house. So there were a lot of enslaved people who worked out their lives right around there, but nobody ever talked about it. Nobody ever, there was no discussion. And then I went off from there in college, I lived in Richmond and DC a couple of times, Boston and New York City, lived in Charlotte and Philadelphia. But I was still curious, everywhere I lived, I was curious about the racial history, about the ethnic history, how people got to be where they were, where they lived. But you know, in a place like Philadelphia, I was only there 3.5, 4 years, there are just miles of packed together row houses, the Latvians over there, and the Lithuanians here, and the Irish, and everybody. And just figuring all that out, I couldn't conceive of it, of what it had been like before. So I would just remain clueless about that because my news beats didn't enable me to learn very much about that. So I rented that cabin on a creek in Lexington and never went back up there. And I worked at the Lexington Bureau, which was great because I covered 3 counties and I did everything in them. And then before I had never worked, when I started out at the paper, one of the papers in Richmond, and women were not permitted to write about crime or, you know, much of any politics or much of anything. So there, in those 3 counties, I did everything. I covered all of the murder trials and everything. So that was interesting. I learned more there than anywhere. And I came down to Roanoke. And at that time, reporters at the Roanoke Times took turns covering Saturday events that would be in the next day's Sunday paper. So, you know, we kind of groused about it. And one Saturday in the summer of '91, I got a little slip of paper saying, you're going to go to a neighborhood reunion. And I thought, oh, what a boring story this is going to be. But for some reason, I guess I had the time, I called up the organizers. There's a lady named Della Milner and Catherine Brooks Johnson. And they explained to me that hundreds of people were coming back to Roanoke and coming together for the first time in 30 or 40 years. They all had lived in northeast Roanoke, which no longer existed. And now I had been driving by 581, about by the Civic Center and by all those parking lots every day, and did not know that anybody had ever lived there. And there used to be hills and thousands of trees and hundreds and thousands of houses and churches and schools, and it was all taken down. So all of a sudden this became a very big story. It didn't run, I don't think it ran on the front page, but I kind of got the gist of what happened before that event. And then at the reunion, it was terrific. I can show you. There we go. So this is 1940. So all of that is northeast. And this is some of northeast and some of Gainesboro. But you see all the trees, and you can't see it very well, but there were lots and lots of hills where now there are the Civic Center, the gas company, and all those things. This was a big eye-opener. Mrs. Milner and Mrs. Johnson referred me to a man named Charles Meadows. There he is. You can kind of see him up at the top of that page. Mr. Meadows took me around in his car. He had a big old Oldsmobile. He was then, well, he was then around 90, and or approaching 90. And he took me and said, that's where my house was, and his house was where the Roanoke Gas Company is. So he could show me where everything was in his beloved neighborhood, in his world. He had lived there for most of his life. I think he may have been born there. I don't remember that. But I know that he worked on his house, 4-bedroom house. He had 5 children. And he worked on that house for, I remember he told me, about 31 years. And it was taken down. It was in tip-top shape, and he said the city officials acknowledged that it was in tip-top shape. But they said the next-door neighbor's house was not. And so it all had to go. All of it. I mean, there was just nothing. The day of that reunion, there was a lady who came to it, who walked all around the old area looking for anything she could pick up to take home, a stone that looked like not gravel, but something that had been there before, and couldn't find anything. Just the churches, schools, and everything was just gone. And this, I always forget to say the basic things, because I think people know this, and they don't, because, people have other things going on in their lives. But when the first destruction came of community, it was to widen Williamson Road. And on those first people, there was a big group of people who lost their homes and churches and schools in that first wave of urban renewal. And it came in waves over decades. But they were told, and I read this in the paper back then, one of the 2 papers, that they could rebuild right there where they had lived, and their neighbors could too, and that they would eventually recreate that neighborhood. But it never happened. So people never forgot that. They never forgot it. And can you imagine what if that happened to you? Okay. So, the thing about Mr. Meadows was, there are some people in this world who are able, what I call them are periscope people. There are people who can periscope up, like the lens that submarines raise up above the water, and they can look around. And so they know the sort of the details of the story, but they also know the big picture. And that was Mr. Meadows. He was just a terrific guy. He had one of the best jobs you could have at the railroad. He was the shopkeeper for 38,000 wooden molds that made every metal piece of the locomotives made here. So it was sort of, he was like a librarian signing out the patterns, I think they call them, for each of those parts, and making sure that they got back and got put in their place. So it's a very responsible job. And so he, but even he could not escape urban renewal. So what he explained to me is that that area that I was driving by every day, what it had been there at one time, including his church, which was in its third building because it's Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, and Greater Mount Zion was getting greater and greater, it was getting bigger and bigger, and so the third, let's see, their third sanctuary was a very handsome brick building that they had just paid off the mortgage, and it was taken down. Merciless, there were no exceptions. And that was Mr. Meadows' church. I remember him telling me about, this is the most painful thing he told me, that the minister, I can't remember his name, said, oh, they wouldn't tear down our church. We just built it 15 years ago. We just paid it off. And Mr. Meadows said, he told him, no, my brother, we're going to have to go from here. I just think I could just see that in a movie. I mean, it's just the most heartbreaking thing.
That church was in the Civic Center parking lot.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Barbara. And there's another story there too, you all may know. There was a lady, Kathleen Vaughn Ross, who lived right near the Civic Center, and you may be showing a picture that has her. Oh, good, yeah. She refused. She was watching all her neighbors sell their houses for cheap and not be able to afford another one because they had to go into formerly white neighborhoods where there was a lot of blockbusting by real estate people and scaring white people out and moving black people into property they could barely afford. And so this lady, Mrs. Ross, who had been the secretary at Gilmer School, one of the first brick schools built in Roanoke. Anyway, she said, no, until you give me a fair price, I'm not leaving here. And they built the Civic Center parking lot around her house. And I think the area of her property covers about 35 spaces. And she moved to a condo and finally got a fair price for her house. She and another lady, there was another woman who lived next door, they both just set it out. I think it was for 11 years. Can you imagine the noise they put up with and the dust and fumes and everything that was going on? Oh, gosh. So anyway, I began to see that Roanoke was a gift to me, that it was my educator and people like Mr. Meadows and Mr. Richard Chubb, who's not here tonight. No, he's not here tonight. Jordan talked with him. Mr. Chubb is just same thing, just really knows his history. And Dr. Walter Clater, the late Dr. Clater, they were like professors to both of us, actually. Because Roanoke's scale is perfect for understanding history. Mr. Meadows could take me to an area and show me exactly, in Philadelphia, people would lose track. They wouldn't be able to figure out where was my house, but here you can. And he was able to point me, or Mr. Chubb would, to go 3 streets over and ask so-and-so, and he'll tell you about another part of this history. Roanoke's scale is just perfect for learning. Anyway, so after that reunion, I was at another event and I ran into Reverend Ivory Morton, who I think is now at Greater Reed Street Baptist, but had been at a church in Buchanan. He's another person with a wide view of things, and he said, you ought to write about what happened. This is a really big story. And I started thinking about it, and it was, and so I talked the newspaper into letting me have some time, and that's what I did in the early 90s. And I was, because of that, that reunion story and some other stories, I was beginning to write about other stories from Gainesboro or former Northeast residents. But, so I started out to do the...
I have to tap the bar.
Oh, okay. So I started, out to do this, to do a big story on what happened with urban renewal. And the first thing, a lot of people in Gainesboro closed their doors to me because they remembered what the newspaper had said. And the newspapers in the 50s the editorial writers had called Northeast, when it was being torn down, a slovenly, quote, slovenly and unsightly place. And they consistently called it a slum. Now, very, very important people in Roanoke's history came out of Northeast Roanoke, like Lawrence Pamela Curtis, and Sally Coleman, who's such an educator, a school board member a long time, lots of other people. So they remembered that, but fortunately, people like Mr. Chubb, Dr. Clater, and other folks got on the phone and vouched for me, and then doors started opening up, and people started sharing their story so that I could tell their story through the newspaper. Because it was such a rich world. Just hundreds of acres of life. There was a chrysanthemum club in Northwest Roanoke. Does anybody know if it still exists? Y'all are too young.
We're your age.
But there was a debutante ball that still goes on. There were just a lot of things. The papers tended to only write about stabbings or gambling or something. There was a lot of life, very happy, prosperous life going on. So with the help of dozens of people I interviewed, we reconstructed that history. Some people still lose sleep thinking about what happened. Because what is really hard to understand is that this went wave after wave over more than 30 years. So you would see Ivory Morton, the minister I was talking about, he was saying that he watched a lot of his neighbors' houses burn down because that was the easy and fastest way to get rid of housing. So the fire department would deliberately burn about 100 houses, several at a time. And I confirmed all this looking at the old clippings and old copies of the paper. The papers, the morning Roanoke Times and the afternoon World News. Okay. Oh, there's Dr. Clater, and this is the last visit Jordan and I had with Dr. Clater in his home, December or January. Mhm. That's his son Mark. This is one of the front page. This is the front page of the special section that the Roanoke Times published in January of 1995. The introduction on the front page, not this page, but another, I wrote, "Black Roanokers still feel wounded and angry about urban renewal. White Roanokers haven't understood why. Today we try to explain." And so what we had done was add up that there were 1,600 homes that were lost during the decades of urban renewal. 24 churches, several historic schools, and at least 200 small businesses. This map was created by staff artist Rob Lunsford. Rob studied the Hills Directory for every house that was in existence in about 1950, and then traveled, even though those streets, many of those streets are gone, certainly in Northeast, but he traveled back and forth and figured out where they all were, and looked at old maps and created that, which is just a powerful, I think a powerful tool for understanding the story. The pink, you can probably hardly see, but the pink squares are the houses that were taken, and the black ones are the ones still there. And you know, I've been asked to speak a lot to groups, churches and all, and I have a lot of good-hearted, older white people who grew up here have asked me that they're puzzled as to why they don't remember Northeast and Gainesboro. You know, there were few positive stories written in the big newspapers. The Roanoke Tribune was reporting all the goings-on, but not the Roanoke Times and the World News. And there was, besides just the general segregation that kept black and white people apart, there was also something about the areas that, especially I think, confused your ordinary white person, who might not otherwise be so racist, and who might have sympathy. You know, white people have always lived in neighborhoods that are segregated by income. So, you know, you're poor, you're working class over here, and you're rich people there, and all that. Because Roanoke and most cities segregated black housing in a certain area, they forced people of all means together in one tight space. So, you know, somebody like Mr. Meadows, he introduced you to, his nice house might be next to a rental house that was not maintained, often owned by a white landlord. But so when white people looked at these neighborhoods, they saw a mix of maintenance and property integrity or whatever that was strange to them. They didn't understand it because all social classes were together. But I don't know, that's just a theory. So, we gave out hundreds of copies of that series, that special section. And one of the people who got one right after they were offered was Dr. Mindy Fullylove. She was then at Columbia University professor. She's a public health psychiatrist. She's a doctor who studies what political decisions, what public decisions mean to individuals, what it does to your health, what it does to your financial strength, your political strength. She is a leading expert on that. And so she got this section and came down to Roanoke and said that this is Roanoke's one of the few cities that has explored what happened. And 9 years after this Street by Street special section, she published Root Shopping, which is about all of this. Roanoke, Newark, and Pittsburgh, as well as some information about Paris and, I said Newark. I'm forgetting the place. Philadelphia, yes. This book has become an urban studies classic around the world. People are, as Stephen said, and especially now that there's displacement from climate change, she has shown us how all kinds of disruption and displacement for any reason, what it does to people. She was here, she's been here many times, about 7 times I think, and Jordan invited her here last fall, and she was on a panel. We had a panel with some other folks, and she looked out at the crowd, which was at the Harrison Museum. It was a black and white crowd, young and old. And it was, she said, Mary, this would not have happened years ago. And there are more groups like this that are interested in learning. And this is Arlene Ollie. That's her brother's bicycle. She's lived in Northeast. Isn't that a great picture? She said she had her own bike, but that promoter took a picture of her and her brother's. There is just much more interest now in what happened during urban renewal. Now, the Evan Spring controversy is discouraging, but Dr. Theodore Lim, who's an urban studies professor at Tech, said that in his studies of North American cities, Roanoke is actually more aware of its history than a lot of other places. And that's something, so we are sort of, I think all of us, as we learn this, we are sad. So we think other people in other places know this, but know what happened in their cities. But I don't know. But it gives me some hope that we can do better. And because Roanoke is small, we can just see how wholesale destruction affects people. I mean, it just wrecks their lives. There are a lot of people who died prematurely, just died of heartbreak. A lot of people lost all their money because they couldn't keep up their house payments in the new places. They were treated rudely when they moved into the old white neighborhoods. So anyway, I really appreciate Roanoke and all the people I learned from, like Jordan.
Good evening.
Make sure I'm doing this right. Can we give a round of applause for Mary one more time? I wanted to read this excerpt from Roanoke before I got started, because, as we said earlier, Mary kind of sparked the interest, not only in Roanoke, but across the country, and what happened when urban renewal hit this small town of Roanoke. But her article kind of took it across, not only America, but across the globe with books like Roanoke. And Dr. Mindy Fullerlove in her book, Roanoke, says, Mary Bishop's assessment of the effects of urban renewal offers an extraordinary window into the impact on the people displaced. Mary said, we still don't see urban renewal as a destructive force because it hadn't been written and it had never been seen and said really except among a few academics a few years ago. People didn't see what had hit them. They didn't see the deep trauma, the assault almost. I am sure that people died as a result of this. I am sure they died way prematurely. And so the article that kind of sparked everyone's interest in urban renewal kind of started for me, and I'll give you a quick family story. It started for me in 1852 when Arminta Hayden was born in Floyd County, Virginia. She married a gentleman by the name of James Stovall. James and Arminta moved to Roanoke, and Arminta had 3 children, three girls, 4 children, 3 girls and 1 son. One of those children was Virginia Stovall, and Virginia Stovall had Robbie Woodliff. Robbie Woodliff married Jack Hale, and Jack Hale and Robbie had Jean Marsh, Jacqueline Bolden, and our Uncle Scoop. Jean Marsh had Kathy Bell. Kathy Bell had Jordan, Ryan, and Kiana Bell. Kathy moved Jordan, Ryan, and Kiana from California to Roanoke. And about 8 years ago, I was attempting to get my daughter, Ral, wave your hand, she's on the phone right now. I was attempting to get my daughter interested in the story that my grandmother, her great-grandmother, and her great-great-aunt and my great-aunt were telling me. They were in their 90s, and they would always mention the name Clater. They would mention the name Henry Street. They would mention we grew up on 7th Avenue, which is Rutherford Avenue. And so one day after church, leaving Loudon Avenue Christian Church one day, I asked my aunt to take me to where she used to live. So she took me to Rutherford Avenue and she pointed to an empty piece of land. And she said, that's where we used to live with all the boys, meaning her uncles. That's where her and her siblings lived. That's where her mother lived and her grandmother lived. And Arminta, who was born enslaved, lived a few streets over with one of her daughters on Harrison Avenue. And they would sit on the front porch and Arminta would read them stories. And so when I found out that my family home was no longer there, well, I asked, what happened to it? And my aunt, verbatim, if you knew Jack Bolden, you knew how she was. She said, well, that urban renewal stuff. And that is when it was just like God's timing. A few weeks after that, I met a gentleman by the name of Richard Chubb. And Richard Chubb was born in Roanoke. He's a retired educator. He was the last principal at Harrison Elementary School before they closed it in 1971. And he picked up a book. I was at an event with him, and he picked up a book, and it was Roanoke, and you could tell that he has really been using this book. It was all bent up, and the pages were ripped out, and he was writing all over it. And he said the psychological damage that it did to him and everybody in his generation was written about in the book Roanoke. And so I went up and introduced myself. As you can see how debonair he is in this photo. He was that debonair when I met him, and he is like this every single day. I met him, and ever since then, I've tried my best to listen to and record every single piece of history that he'll ever tell me. Whenever I'm around Mr. Chubb, I don't care what it is, I'm recording Mr. Chubb tell stories. And he continued to tell me, well, you need to talk to this person, and you need to talk to this person. And one of those people was Mary Bishop. And he said that Mary Bishop wrote an article, and the book Root Shock kind of sparked that. And so I've been on this type of journey to not only find out my family story, but to kind of tie all of Roanoke's history to the greater history in the United States. And so it all started, I wanted to get my daughter interested in learning the history. She didn't want to go to the library with me and check out any books. She didn't want to listen to me talk about it all the time. And I was able to get her to go with me to interview some elders in the community. She really enjoys hanging out with Mr. Chubb. But I asked her, I said, Zariah, if I walked you around and pointed to things and told you about it, would you do that? She said, yeah, I'll do that, I'll do that. And that is what sparked the walking tours that I did. And so, because I had a history of my grandmother telling me about her story, I wanted to share that story with my daughter, and that is what kind of sparked me sitting in front of you today. And I was able to meet Mr. Chubb, and Mr. Chubb has been, by far, the greatest influence on my life over the past 8 years. I have a suit on tonight because of Mr. Chubb. So, this photo here is my favorite photo of Gainesboro. This photo is from 1924. And you can see in the photo, to the right of the photo, you'll see Hotel Roanoke. Over to the left of the photo, you'll see the Henry Street Bridge, which is now the Martin Luther King Bridge. And so if you follow that bridge, on the left is the Hotel Dumas, on the right is the places like the Virginia Theater. This beautiful church structure right there in the middle is High Street Baptist Church, the original High Street Baptist Church. And at the top of the photo, to the right, you'll see the original First Baptist Church, where if you know the name Howard Thurman was ordained at that church in the 1920s. Then if you go further up Jefferson Street, because this is Jefferson Street, you'll see St. Andrew's Catholic Church at the top. If you come to the left, you can barely see it, but the 23-room Clater Mansion is in that photo as well. And this is my favorite photo of Gainesboro. This is 1924. And you can see the homes that were across the street from the Hotel Roanoke on Wales Avenue. You can see behind High Street Baptist Church, that is now Roanoke Higher Education Center's parking lot. That is actually behind the Claude Moore Center. And there was a Booker T. Washington Trade School in that parking lot. You can kind of see the number and the density of the homes and businesses. And as Mary showed the 1940 photo, you can also see the amount of trees and buildings and businesses in this photo as well. And so, if you were to do this today, majority of the middle of the photo would be a parking lot. And so as the journey goes on, this is Duke Ellington inside the Hotel Dumas. So as Mary said earlier, Henry Street had over 200 businesses. Barbershops, movie theaters, cab companies, film studios, where Oscar Michaud, one of the first black filmmakers, had his film studio, and he shot 3 films here. Oliver Hill opened up his law practice on Henry Street. Dr. Harry T. Penn had his dental office on Henry Street. The original Borough Hospital originated on Henry Street. If you go over there today, there's the Dumas Center and the Claude Moore Center. And those are the only 2 structures on Henry Street. But Henry Street was a place where Duke Ellington would come after performing somewhere, and he couldn't go to the Hotel Roanoke because it was segregated. So he came to Henry Street. And this is him actually inside the Hotel Dumas. This is a photo of African-American Norfolk and Western men in front of the Lincoln Theater. This building still stands today. This is across the street from the Dumas Center, this building here. And this is a beautiful photo to kind of give you an understanding of what Gainsborough was, during that time. Here's another photo. So this photo is as if you're standing at the Martin Luther King statue looking up Henry Street towards Wells Avenue. On the left is the Hotel Dumas. These buildings here are no longer there, and you can see the amount of buildings that were up Henry Street. And when Mr. Chubb was interviewed by Dr. Mindy Fullilove, he grew up on Chestnut Avenue, and he said when he would go to Henry Street, he would see neon. He said he didn't have to go to New York City to see neon. He would see it right here on Henry Street. And as I gave you my family history, I mentioned a woman by the name of Robbie Board, who was my great-grandmother. That's Robbie Board, my great-grandmother. And the gentleman next to her is Mr. Oliver Hill. Where Oliver Hill and Robbie Board went to Gainsborough School, and guess who their teacher was? Miss Lucy Addison. And Oliver Hill grew up on Gilmer Avenue. My great-grandmother grew up a few streets away from him. And they would attend each other's birthday parties, and they were childhood best friends. And this is when Oliver Hill came back to receive the key to the city. And as Oliver Hill was sitting down and my great-grandmother walked in the door, according to my mother, he would always say, well, where's my Robbie? Where's my Robbie at? And Oliver Hill lived with a family called the Pentecost family. That's my nephew in the back. Bradford and Lila Pentecost on Gilmer Avenue. That home still stands at 401 Gilmer Avenue. And Oliver Hill was very proud of Mrs. Pentecost, because Mrs. Pentecost, one, she would turn away any man that would come to her door looking to sell something and would not remove his hat, white or black. You could not come to Mrs. Pentecost's house unless you removed your hat. And she also grew parsley in the backyard of their home. And Mr. Pentecost was a chef on the railroad. And this is an African-American family during the early 1900s. Mrs. Pentecost grew parsley in the backyard of their home, and she provided all of the parsley and vegetables for the railroad. Now, this is an African-American woman in the early 1900s. Mr. Pentecost was a chef on the railroad, and the father of Robbie Board, Robert Woodliff, was a waiter on the railroad. Well, I was listening to an interview by Oliver Hill on History Makers on YouTube, and he was talking about Mr. Pentecost took some waiters down to the railroad so that they could get jobs. Well, I had heard this interview for years, and I never paid attention to it. He said he took a man by the name of Woodliff down to the railroad, where Woodliff is my great-great-grandfather. And so Oliver Hill and Mr. Pentecost and the Woodliff family, which Robbie Board was a member of, were very close, a tight-knit community. And my daughter will tell you, when we walked by the Oliver Hill on the tour, that's the only place that I can get her to talk at on the tour. It's her favorite part of the tour, the Oliver Hill story. And so these stories is what kind of sparked my interest in learning more about the story of Gainsborough, because it all tied together. Mary talked about the African-American community during that time. Because of segregation, it was such a tight-knit community. You could live right next door to your doctor. If you worked on the railroad, you could live right next door to your doctor, and across the street was your lawyer, behind you was your teacher, and down the street was your pastor. That's the type of community that African-Americans grew up in due to segregation. Well, listening to the oral histories at the Gainsborough Library that Carla Lewis did many, many years ago, I came across one of those oral histories by a woman by the name of Mrs. Patrice Burwell. And Mrs. Patrice Burwell was a retired educator here in Roanoke. And when I heard her story, I was blown away because I had heard that people were moved out and that they were given a certain amount of money, but most of them were not. But there was never a dollar amount that somebody told me that they were given for their property. So Mary talked about Northeast. So there were 3 urban renewal projects: the Commonwealth Project, the Kimball Project, and the Gainsborough Project. Northeast and Commonwealth and Kimball were all of the Northeast section. Everything from the interstate back towards the gas company, where the post office is, and the Magic City Ford, McDonald's. Oh, my great-grandmother was born where the main post office is. Well, if you go over to Gainsborough, on Gainsborough Road, right in front of the library, on that street were businesses and homes as well. Well, Miss Patrice Burwell says in that article, my daddy's first house is on Gainsborough, and that house was passed down to the family. I'm the last one living in the family. Now, this was done over 20 years ago. So I got that house. When they started remodeling, not remodeling, that renovation stuff that they talked about, they took that house, and that was a very sad experience for me because he had it before I was born. And he rented it out for a long time. In fact, I rented it out when I had it. When the city took it, and it was right up from Gainsborough, about the 3rd house going up that hill. Mary talked about hills. And they took that house and gave me $800. Wow. That's what they paid for my house. My sister had a 2-story house next door. That was passed down to her as well, because my uncle left that house to her, to my mother, and my mother left it to my sister. She got $800. It was a beautiful 2-story house. It was beautiful. $800, you know, $800. Of course I bought it, and I got $800, and they said they didn't even want the house.
Wow.
They just wanted the land. Now this was done over this oral history was done over 20, 25 years ago, and she was in her 90s at this time. So that was the first time I heard a dollar amount put on someone having their home taken away. And it was also, it put it into perspective for me because I just thought it happened in the Northeast section, but it happened right there on Gainsborough Road, which is a very busy and main road in the city of Roanoke now. And this is a photo of Miss Patrice Burwell, and she lived to be over 100 years old. And so Mary spoke about a woman by the name of Kathleen Ross, who was the last person to leave the northeast part of Roanoke. And she mentioned they built the Civic Center around her home. Well, if you look closely, you'll see 3 homes right here. Mrs. Ross's home was right in the middle. Her father bought that home in the 1920s. As Mary said, she was the secretary at Gilmer School. And you can see the newly constructed Civic Center right here. They hadn't even finished the parking lot in this photo here. And here's the interstate right through here. And Mrs. Ross's granddaughter and son said that the swing set was right in here. And when her granddaughter was at the house, the interstate was behind her, and she could look across and see St. Andrew's Catholic Church from her grandmother's back porch. And so Mrs. Ross, again, was the last person to leave Northeast because she just refused to sell until she got a justified amount that she thought for her property. And so Mary showed a 1940 aerial photo of the Northeast section. Well, this is from that same article that Mary wrote in 1995, and this photo is from 1995. So here's Wells Fargo, Here's the Hotel Roanoke. And let me go all the way back. I really need you to understand. So here's the same photo. So this is 1940. That's my niece. That's the Hotel Roanoke in the middle. And so now, going back to the 1995 photo, now, mind you, this right here was a parking lot then. Now this is the Roanoke Higher Education Center, Claude Moore Center now. So here's the Dumas Center here. And Henry Street went all the way through to Gilmer Avenue. So it was a through street. And here is First Baptist Church. And that church was set ablaze in 1995. Right around the same time that the Clare Clinic was set ablaze as well. Now, to quickly give you some history, in Roanoke before the 1900s, there was not a heavy population of African American physicians here. Dr. Isaac D. Burrow, the first photo that you see, was born in Amelia County, Virginia in 1865. He moved here to Roanoke in the 1890s after graduating medical school. He opened up a pharmacy on Gainsborough Road, the Burrow Pharmacy. He built a mansion on top of Patton Avenue in 1905 with his wife. And Dr. Burrow and his wife were such important figures that the Richmond Planet newspaper, a black newspaper in Richmond, sent a special reporter here to Roanoke to write a full-page ad on Dr. Burrow when he and his wife built his home. And Dr. Burrow he was the leading African-American physician here in Roanoke. Well, if you've been on tours or if you've heard about the Burrow history, you know that in 1914, he became ill with a gallstone issue. And even though Dr. Burrow was a doctor himself, even though he was looked at as upper middle class African American, he was refused all surgery, not only by white hospitals in Roanoke, but the entire state of Virginia. He, his wife, and Dr. James Roberts, who was this gentleman here, traveled by boxcar on a train. He slept on a cot over 200 miles to Freeman's Hospital on the campus of Howard University. Now again, he is a doctor himself. And because they did not have the proper tools and resources then, these doctors were not able to perform that type of surgery on their colleague. So he, his wife, and Dr. Roberts traveled over 200 miles to Freeman's Hospital on the campus of Howard University, where he received surgery. Tragically, he passed away after that surgery. And in 1915, in March the following year, Dr. John B. Clater Sr., the gentleman in the back, Dr. Lyburn C. Downing, the gentleman here, Dr. James Roberts, Dr. S.F. Willman, and Dr. Jerry S. Cooper, with the help of Mrs. Burrow and the help of Lucy Addison, started the first Burrow Hospital at 311 Henry Street. If you're familiar with Gainsborough, Wells Avenue, where First Baptist Church is, their parking lot was the original Burrow Hospital. And in 1921, the city of Roanoke moved Burrow Hospital to the old Allegheny Boys Institute on McDowell Avenue. And then eventually in the 1950s, they built the building that we now know today as Blue Ridge Healthcare, where that used to be Burrow Hospital. Well, this photo here are many of the doctors that were at Burrow during that time. And in this photo, there's 3 Clater doctors. So this is Dr. F.W. Claytor in his military uniform, Dr. Lidburn C. Downing. In the back of him is Dr. John B. Claytor Sr., the father of Dr. F.W. Claytor. This is Dr. W.F. Brown. This is Dr. James Roberts. This is Dr. George Moore. This is Dr. John B. Claytor Jr. And behind Dr. John B. Claytor Jr. is Dr. Maynard Law. And I don't know the first name of this gentleman here, but I believe it's Dr. Brown as well. But this photo was taken on the steps of the Old Allegheny Boys Institute. And all of these medical physicians here, if you were African American from 1900 up into the 1970s, you saw one of these doctors here. Even after that, Dr. Law practiced many years after that at the Veterans Hospital, I believe. But this is what, and all of these individuals, guess where they lived? Right next door to their patients. They lived right next door to their patients. Dr. Roberts lived next door to Edward Dudley. Dr. Edward Dudley was the first black dentist in Roanoke. Well, Dr. Edward Dudley had a son, Edward Dudley. The son, Edward Dudley, became the first black ambassador in the country. Grew up right on Gilmer Avenue. So all of these individuals lived right next door to their patients. And that was the importance of what Gainesboro was. And I'll be finishing with this. My daughter's favorite part of the tour is Oliver Hill. My favorite part of the tour is the Claytor family.
I like this part too.
She likes this part too. Dr. John B. Claytor Sr. was born in Floyd County, Virginia, in the Copper Hill area. He went to Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. He went to Shaw University Leonard Medical School, received his medical degree, same university that Dr. Burrow went to. Dr. Claytor moved here and opened up his practice in 1907. He lived with the Burrow family before getting married to Mrs. Claytor in 1911. Mrs. Claytor was born in Tennessee, and she was Presbyterian, and the Downing family were very prominent at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, and the Downing family knew the Woodfin family in Tennessee, and Mrs. Claytor was Roberta Woodfin before she was Roberta Claytor. Well, Mrs. Claytor's father sent her to Roanoke, according to their children, to learn the Presbyterian way. And when she came to Roanoke on the railroad, who was commissioned to go and pick her up off the railroad on his horse and buggy? It was Dr. John B. Claytor. According to their children, it was love at first sight, and they were married in 1911. They had 8 children. In this photo here, there's 7 of their 8 children. This photo was taken in their 23-room mansion that Mrs. Claytor's father built in the early 1920s. They also built a gas station, so they still own, the property that's directly across the street from the Gainesboro Library. It's about an acre of land, and it was Jefferson Street, Patton Avenue, Gilmer Avenue, and Old Gainesboro Road now. In the early 1920s, they built a mansion, they built a service station, and 3 of their sons went into the medical field. And one of their sons was a Tuskegee Airman. And 2 of their daughters went into the medical field. Well, Mrs. Claytor wanted her husband and her children to work together. So she basically told Dr. Claytor, you need to build a clinic so you and the boys can work together. Well, in the 1940s, they started the construction of Claytor Memorial Clinic. Unfortunately and tragically, Mrs. Claytor passed away before they opened the doors to the clinic. And this photo here is from the late 1940s, before 1951, because Dr. Claytor Sr. passed away in 1951. But this photo was taken at the opening ceremony of Claytor Memorial Clinic. And this building still stands today. But this building were actually two buildings that connected. In 1995, the same year that First Baptist Church burned down, part of the medical clinic burned down, a few months apart. And as Mary said earlier, Reverend Ivory Morton talked about seeing homes around his neighborhood burn up in flames. Well, Dr. Walter Claytor, until his dying day, always believed that the fire that was set at his family's property was purposely set because this 23-room mansion was burned down as well. Their gas station was burned down. And part of their medical clinic was burned down. And all of this happened within a 10, 20-year period of time. And Dr. Walter Claytor, who is and was one of the strongest, toughest individuals I ever met. Very intellectual, always knew what he was talking about. He always told you exactly how he felt. And he never forgot, even in his older age, he lived to be 98 years old, he never forgot what the city of Roanoke did to his family. Eminent domain was put on this property in 1972. Eminent domain, really quick, is a constitutional law that basically says if a government deems your property for better use for the overall growth of the city, they can use eminent domain, give you just compensation for your property, come in and take your property. But they're supposed to do something with the property. They're also supposed to give you just compensation for the property. This property was put under eminent domain in 1972, and it took Dr. Walter Claytor and the Claytor family taking out a lawsuit against the Housing Authority in 2001 for something to be done with the property. And Dr. Walter Claytor became the first private citizen to win an eminent domain case against a government agency, and the ownership of the property went back to the family. Now again, this was 5 or 6 years after the fires, so the property wasn't able to be used anyway. And if you drive by there today, this is what you will see. Now, this was a building that was built for an African-American family to take care of a community. There's old files in the Gainsborough Library that says a tooth was pulled for 25 cents. Surgery was done for a couple of dollars. Mary always talks about one of her favorite stories that Dr. Walter Claytor told, that they used to do a lot of things for free because they wanted to take care of their community. He knew the importance of taking care of their community. So this is what the Claytor Clinic looks like today. In the 1940s, across the street from this clinic, Reuben Lawson, a lawyer who fought on segregation cases, who John Fishwick and Reverend E.T. Burton are looking to name the federal Hoff building after, his law practice was directly across the street from this building. That building still stands. A very vibrant area that with the stroke of a pen completely decimated an area. So people always ask me, well, Jordan, is there similarities between Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood, and Roanoke, Virginia? Absolutely. The only difference is the bombs that were dropped on Roanoke were signed by government officials. And that is the impact of what this now, all we see And before I finish and sit down, I always need to tell people this because I made a promise to myself and I made a promise to Dr. Walter Claytor. This building, this story, this family is the key to Roanoke actually being a 7-time All-American city. Until this is taken care of, Roanoke cannot be an All-American
I
city.
know that's right.
Because this is what made Roanoke, Roanoke. When an African-American family in the 20s, 30s, and 40s can build a 23-room mansion with their own hands. Dr. Walter Claytor helped build this clinic that he also worked in. The Tuskegee Airman Ralph Claytor kept the books for the clinic, and he ran the service station. They built a 23-room mansion. This is what makes Roanoke Roanoke. And because of people like Mary Bishop and Dr. Fullilove, this story has gone global. But until this is completed, Roanoke cannot fulfill its All-American City award. So I'll finish with this. It's very important. I try to implement this into my daughter every single day. It's very important that you sit down with whoever you think has a story, which is everyone, and learn their story. Just sit down and just ask them. First question you can ask them: when and where you were born. I asked Mr. Chubb that 8 or 9 years ago, and I've spent hours with him talking about his story. Our story is what makes us who we are. And this story right here is what made Gainesboro what it was and what made Roanoke what it was. And this is a very important piece to that. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Who's got a question or two? We've got time for a few questions. I definitely want to take advantage of our speakers.
Jordan?
That's all I can say.
Hang on, we've got a hand up in the back.
Thank you.
Good.
Jordan, what do you see, what do you want to see done with the building on the screen right now?
This building here,
Yeah.
some type of medical facility,
Yes.
medical facility in the area, but then also it could be a medical facility and also a community center. Yes.
I believe I heard you tell a story of, at another place, but I might be crazy, about Muhammad Ali being treated in Roanoke.
I don't remember.
Oh, I was afraid you were going to say that. I'll go look that up later.
One of his trainers, Dr. David Imhotep, who recently passed away, lived in Roanoke.
I thought there was some story about him being in a fight nearby and being injured and treated afterwards.
That was at community hospital.
Got your hand up?
You're going to put me on a path.
Go ahead.
When you told the story about the lady that lived to be over 100 that got $800 for her home that had been passed down to her, and so did her sister, what year was that? Do you know?
That was in the 90s.
In the 90s?
80s or 90s.
What year did you get the house?
Oh, what year did she get the money? Oh, I'm not 100% sure about when the house was taken. I thought you were asking me about the interview.
No.
I'm not 100% sure when the house was actually taken.
Regardless, 800 was not market rate.
Right,
Yeah.
I was just curious
We have
what year they seized the house.
Mm-hmm.
Hand up over here. And we also have Mary Bishop over here if you have questions for her. She's
Jordan, it's my understanding that the money set aside, $5 million for Gainesboro, will expire at the end of 2024. If it is not if the plan isn't set? What is the status of the plan?
Well,
No. We want the truth, because I don't think we're hearing it.
well, I'm gonna tell you the quick truth. So there was $10 million set aside for Gainsborough, $5 million from the federal money, and then $5 million from the general fund that the city matched. The original plan was to turn the Claytor property into the medical hub and renovate the Lawson building, and to bring back some businesses in the area, or attempt to bring back some businesses. Well, the city and the family, the Claytor family, could not come to an agreement, so the city took the general fund money out of the Gainsborough hub money. We didn't find that out until a couple of months ago. And they put that money to a different project, which is the Eureka Park project. And so now there's only $5 million, and that is federal money. And so they plan to spend upwards to about $2.5 million to turn Gainsborough Road from a 4-lane street to a 2-lane street. Because the quickness of the traffic, but also they're working on the 2nd Street Bridge, which goes into downtown right below the Roanoke Times building. So this is perfect timing for them to do a road project. And then $500,000 of that money is going into housing in the Northeast Historical Preservation section of Gainsborough. And then $1 million, I think I got my math right, is going, no, $2 million, I'm sorry, is going into recreational areas, an amphitheater on the side yard of the Gainsborough Library, and a playground on both sides of Gainsborough. Do I agree with the $2.5 million going to the road? No, and Wayne Leffridge and Bob Cal in the city of Roanoke hear it every single time I can tell them that. But if we don't spend that money on some type of project, our concern is that that money is going to be put somewhere else in the city or given back to the federal government. Yes.
I thought the Gainsborough community was really supposed to decide how they wanted that money to be spent. And I heard housing was one of the...
Housing was one of them. Housing was the big part of it. According to the city, the Gainsborough community did decide on what to do with that money. Now, is it the majority of the community? No, but it's the people that come to the meetings that kind of decided on what to do with those funds. But it's not the majority of the community deciding on what is done with that $5 million. That was originally $10 million. Yes.
Catherine, you have anything?
Mentioned David Ramey's walk on Sunday?
Yes. Polly, what time is the April 28th event?
2 p.m., 2 to 4 p.m. at the Gainsborough Garage parking lot, which is next to the Martin Luther King sculpture and bridge.
We didn't hear what it,
They'll be showcasing David Ramey.
Mural, they're making copies and enlargements of some of David Ramey's works, which were drawings, as well as stories. If anybody has not gone to see that exhibit, it is still at the Harrison Museum of African Culture downtown Center in the square. Open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 3.
great, thank you. Good question. Other questions? Yes.
I think every time this kind of talk is done, more and more people understand in more depth the situation. There are a lot of groups in Roanoke who try to advocate for certain things. They might appear before city council and those things. Is this a fair question? Are there certain groups that are more effective in their ways of approaching as they moved up to the city government, and they started doing billboards. Kind of, maybe unexpected things to show that they loved the community. And I don't know if they were bird dogs on this. But there are two things I'm asking. One is the sort of the most effective thing that just the individuals can do, because it's so frustrating going to those planning meetings.
It is.
Always comes to the same thing.
I would say the Friends of Evans Springs.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, are there any groups in Roanoke that are the most effective?
The most effective, the most maybe creative.
Most effective, most creative that I can think of, and I would name the group Friends of Evans Springs. It's a very diverse group, age, ethnicity, where they live in the city, and they've been able to advocate, even though we disagreed with the vote. That group has been able to advocate like I've never seen before when it comes to development in the city of Roanoke. So Friends of Evans Springs would be a group that I would mention. And then your local neighborhood organization. Your local neighborhood organization is the key to it all. If you have a strong neighborhood organization, a majority of the people who live in your community, that does make a huge impact. Florine Thornhill comes to mind with NNEO. She started it 40, 50 years ago. What she was able to do, based off of just wanting to better her neighborhood, shows us what we can do with a strong neighborhood organization.
You don't need to move to live in a better place.
Yes, you don't have to move to live in a better place. But right now, I would say Friends of Evans Springs is the largest grassroots organization that really, can make a difference. Yeah.
Got time for one more question, so you got it. Yes, please.
Mine was a comment. Roanoke is a 7-time All-American city, and they are on the list to be nominated for their 8th time, and it's on community, the topic is community engagement and community awareness. So that's going to be decided in June if Roanoke City gets to be an 8th All-American city.
This has been the longest lecture we've had, and I'm so thrilled because we had 2 fabulous speakers. The content could have gone for 3 more hours. I think it's not a pleasant task to have to